Runways are roads for aircraft, the spearhead of modern armies. Scattered across the islands and coral atolls of the Pacific are the relics of the American advance towards Japan in the Second World War. The engineers who built these runways, often the famous Seabees of the US Navy, were truly the architects of the counteroffensive. For these islands were MacArthur's stepping stones towards Japan, ports and bases, but also bomb-proof aircraft carriers.
Well, we was bombed every day, I think. In the time we was there, we was bombed 133 times, and we shelled practically every day out of the hills. One morning when we went to work, there was enough bodies on that. We had to stop and dig silos to bury the bodies before we could go to work the next morning.
One day when we were working on Yontan airstrip on Okinawa, which was the largest strip on the island, we heard a plane coming in. It sounded like a medium-sized bomber, and we assumed naturally one of ours coming in to land on the strip, which was usable at that time. And all of a sudden we looked up, and it was a Japanese plane, a medium-sized bomber which had been converted for troops. And much to our amazement, with our mouths open unbelievingly, we saw the plane land, stop, and Japanese commandos, approximately 50 in number, began pouring out of this plane with their machine guns and their hand grenades and their plastic bombs, and shooting and throwing hand grenades, and instantly creating pandemonium all over the place. So, having recognized the insignia on the plane and all of a sudden knowing that we were being shot at by these commandos, we hurriedly raced to our weapons as close as they were, and took about 2 hours to clear the runway again.
During the Second World War, Gibraltar served the Allies as an unsinkable aircraft carrier at the mouth of the Mediterranean. But the airstrip here was only the latest in a long history of sappering achievements at Gibraltar. The Rock is the birthplace of the Royal Engineers. After their capture of the Rock in 1704, the British set about fortifying it against future Spanish attack. To assist them, they formed a company of soldier artificers and began to tunnel. In time, the soldier artificers became the Royal Sappers and Miners, until they, in turn, became the Royal Engineers. 200 years later, they're still burrowing. Today, the Rock of Gibraltar, just 2 square miles in area, contains 34 miles of tunnels. Yet it began almost by accident. 500 feet up the rock face is a protrusion known as the Notch. In 1782, during the Great Siege, attempts were made to get a cannon onto the Notch so as to be able to direct flanking fire onto the Spanish lines, and a £1,000 prize was offered for a solution to the problem. A sergeant major in the artificer company came up with the answer: to tunnel inside the rock face until he broke through onto the Notch. But tunneling was to generate its own problems. As soon as they'd gone a few yards, the smoke and dust made further progress impossible. To allow the fumes out and the fresh air in, it was necessary to blast a hole out to the face of the rock. But in doing so, they found they had unwittingly created the perfect gun emplacement. And so the tunnel continued, with cannon after cannon placed in the holes. In fact, they never bothered to break through on top of the Notch as planned, but instead excavated the space beneath to create a magnificent windowed cavern, St. George's Hall. So spectacular is it that it was to become the setting for receptions, including a dinner party given in honor of American President Grant by the governor of the Rock. So began the tunneling, which was to continue for another 2 centuries. In these galleries, the sappers of the 18th century marked their work with the date of its completion. there are other signs, too, of a much later occupation. The gun embrasures in this chamber, built in 1790, have been reinforced in 1941 to take machine guns. Above the gun ports, now bricked up, are the range cards painted by the gunners. The view is across the isthmus to the frontier. The purpose of fortification in 1941 was no different from that in 1791. In the early years of the war, Churchill had received intelligence that Hitler was negotiating with Franco to allow German troops through Spain to attack Gibraltar from the mainland. Accordingly, he instructed that the entire garrison, no fewer than 17,000 people, should be accommodated inside the rock. And so the tunneling began again in earnest. Everything which existed outside the rock was duplicated inside. Barracks, stores, hospitals, workshops. The tunnel system became a self-contained fortress. This was once the rock's power station. And at the very center, more than 1,000 feet below the summit, the headquarters of General Eisenhower. From here, in 1943, he planned the conquest of North Africa, Operation Torch. But the work continues to this day. Down this tunnel are the magazines from which the ships of the Falklands Task Force were stocked, the ammunition being taken direct to the dockside. Mole's End Way, it's called, the last tunnel to be built here by the sappers of the Royal Engineers. Gibraltar is a natural fortress, but in the absence of such suitable geographical features, the engineer must build his own fortification. Jericho, the oldest city known to man, is a fortified stronghold. Its defenses exhibit the twin features common to all fortified places. The wall, designed to keep attackers out, and the tower raised to dominate their attack should they try to break in. To match the power of the defense, the attacking sappers would often build their own towers, hoping to overtop the defenders. Their ultimate aim was one of two things, either to climb the wall or to break it down. Many of their wall-breaching devices, like the battering ram and the giant pick, which dislodged stones from the wall's face, were particularly favored by the Romans, the greatest siege engineers of antiquity. A favorite siege engine of theirs was the ballista, which threw stones at or into the enemy's defenses. It worked on the torsion principle, like the suspension of a modern car. The arm was cranked down against the tension of twisted sinews. When released, it threw a missile with great force and fair accuracy, 300 or 400 yards. This is Masada by the Dead Sea in Israel. It's a spectacular example of the two sides of the engineer's art. On top of this 600-foot rock, the engineers of King Herod built a fortress. It was here, during the Jewish rebellion against the Romans in 70 AD, that 900 zealots made their last stand. It seemed, from a military point of view, an impregnable position. They had strong fortifications and a double wall made from stone quarried on the site. They had food in storerooms and water in cisterns carved out of the rock. The German engineers faced a formidable challenge at the foot of the rock down here. They started their siege conventionally enough. You can still see the remains of the encircling wall and the 8 fortified camps they built, as well as the stones their catapults hurled at the defenders. But to storm the fortress, they had to get their siege towers and battering rams close enough to breach the walls. Their solution was simple, if monumental in execution. It was this: a colossal earthen ramp to bring their siege engines to the level of the fortress. It took many months and who knows how many lives to complete. But it worked. The breach was made and Masada fell. Nearly 2,000 years later, the ramp still stands, an inspiring monument to the engineer's art. Where soil formation and the water table permitted, a favorite Sapper siege technique was mining. It was employed here at Rochester, in the civil war between King John and his barons. Indeed, until the invention of gunpowder, it remained the best method known of collapsing a wall. Moats and ditches, which appear to be defenses against surface attack only, were actually also intended to make mining difficult or impossible. Miners, nevertheless, often succeeded in finding a way under. The technique was to sink a shaft out of range of the enemy's missiles and then drive a gallery to the foot of the wall. Once they had tunneled under it, the miners enlarged a chamber, shoring up its roof with timber to support the wall's foundations while they worked. Kindling was then packed in and ignited. When the timber burned through, the chamber collapsed, bringing down the wall above. Explosives, when they appeared, obviated the need to use fire. Otherwise, mining techniques remained identical. It was practiced extensively on the Western Front during the First World War, when coal miners, enlisted as soldiers, dug mines against each other. The mine that produced this gigantic hole in the ground took months to build. The men who dug it, starting from an entrance almost a quarter of a mile behind the British front line, were members of the 179th Tunnelling Company, Royal Engineers, miners in civilian life who hacked their way through the chalk of the Somme countryside as through a coal seam. At one time, the British had brought in mechanical diggers of the kind used to carve out the tunnels of the London Underground. But in the end, it was found that human labor was quicker and more effective, and so the men forced their way through by shovel and pick. Disposal of the subsoil was another problem. The sudden appearance of dumps of chalk behind the lines would have been spotted by enemy observers. So every last piece of chalk was taken away in sandbags. The perpetual danger was of being overheard as they dug, and the perpetual anxiety was of being countermined by the enemy. Well, this mine was in the end a complete success, packed with 60,000 pounds of explosive. It was blown at 2 minutes before 0 hour on the 1st of July, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and took perhaps as many as 100 Germans with it.